Uniate priest Andriy Sheptitsky, later a bishop, who got along well with both Bandera and the Nazis, wrote an analytical note to the emperor, where he directly pointed out, in order to tear Ukraine from Russia, it is necessary to cause a split in the Russian Orthodox Church. And, not limiting himself to verbal exercises, in 1908 year, he went to Russia to put theory into practice, using forged documents. In response, the Russians began to massively switch from Uniatism to Orthodoxy. This movement had a leader, hieromonk Alexei Kovalyuk. His followers were arrested for allegedly spying for Russia, or even tortured, demanding to return to Uniatism. The real mass repressions began. Excerpts from the secret report of General Rimmel. Galician Russians are divided into two groups, Russophiles and Ukrainophiles. My opinion tells me that all Russophiles are radical, and that they should be mercilessly destroyed. Ukrainians are friends of Austria, and under the strong leadership of government circles, can become honest Austrians. It is noteworthy that the general calls Russians, even those Galicians, whom his subordinates diligently tried to transform, into the shield of their Ukrainians. True, there were still a few years left before the merciless destruction. So far, the hands were short, we had to act with an eye on Russia, where they already understood. In modern terms, there is a serious threat to national security. However, the Austrians, along with savage administrative pressure on Russophiles, continued to initiate legal proceedings on charges of espionage in favor of Russia. A group of leaders of Russophile cultural organizations was even sentenced to death. They were saved only by the personal intervention of Nicholas II, who acted through the Spanish king as an intermediary. With the outbreak of the First World War, the Austrians' hands were untied, and what the Ruthenians would later call the Galician Golgotha began. On the very first day of the war, the authorities dispersed every single Russophile organization and society, up to cooperative shops and orphanages. Tens of thousands of people were captured by gendarmes and troops as Russian spies, and imprisoned in the Talerhof and Terezin concentration camps. Many never reached the camps. They were simply finished off in the middle of the street by brutalized gendarmes and soldiers in Kiev, in Bukovina, in Carpathian Russia. The Society of Former Prisoners of Talerhof, organized later in Lviv by the Central Talard Committee, believed that about 60,000 people died in this massacre. Men and women, old and very young, Russians who were tortured in Talerhof and Terezin are also considered many thousands. Actually, the first concentration camps were invented by the British during the Boer War, but it was in Africa. And in Europe, the Austrians were the first to be noted, long before Hitler. The Talard Committee from 1924 to 1934 published in Russian 4 issues of the Talard Almanac, detailing the history of fanaticism and violence against civilians. In 1964, they were brought together into one book, republished in the USA, and 10 years ago, a reprint edition appeared in Kiev, where I managed to buy it. Reading is creepy. There were no crematoriums or gas chambers in the concentration camps. The Austrians still did not think of such a thing. But all the same, the regime there was frankly well known. Scanty food, bullying, torture, murder. There were a lot of Ukrainian fills among the capo, who surpassed any Bosnian in sadism. It was Bosnian soldiers who made up the majority of the camp guards. By the way, those same Skiri mostly wrote denunciations to the secret police against Muscovite spies. Prisoners were not left alone after death. The neighbors in the barracks who kept them in the camp cemetery put Orthodox crosses with 3 crossbars over the graves, but the guards immediately broke off or sawed off 2, so that the cross looked as much like a Catholic one as possible. In Terezin, located on the territory of the Czech Republic, the regime was a little easier. The Czechs here, we must pay tribute to them, were not brutalized over the ruins as the Austrians, Hungarians, Bosnians and Shurs, but just a little bit. Only after the death of Emperor Joseph of France the new Emperor Charles I ordered the release of the prisoners of Talerhof and Terezin on May 7, 1917. Probably not out of the kindness of my heart. By that time, Vienna had already begun to understand that they could lose the war, and therefore they should try to conclude a separate peace with Russia, showing themselves white and fluffy. In his rescript of his release, the young emperor wrote with frank cynicism, "All the arrested Russians are innocent, but they were arrested so as not to become them." Following this logic, many thousands of Russians were tortured and killed out of a kind of concern for them, as if they were not guilty of something. Even during the existence of the concentration camps, some deputies of the Austro-Hungarian parliament, choking with pleasure, praised in every way the wise policy of the authorities in the fight against Muscovites. Starting from 1915th year, the armed forces of the future independent state began to be created. Marchukov, Russians, Germans and Austrians, with the active participation of Ukrainian nationalists, began to conduct propaganda in the prisoner of war camps, educating the captured Little Russian soldiers in the Ukrainian spirit, instilling in them that they are Ukrainians, they are not Russians, that Ukrainians and Russians, these are completely different peoples whose interests are different. These prisoners who recognized themselves as Ukrainians became the so-called Sich Sagittarians. Only here's the bad luck. Of the 27,000 prisoners who were actively ideologically processed, less than 2,000 signed up for the Streltsy. And the Galician commanders were in no hurry to join the glorious ranks of fighters for independence, preferring to live at a safe distance from the front, which we observe today during the battles in the southeast of Ukraine. The Germans also joined the financing of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, acting through the notorious banker and merchant Parvis. By the end of 1917, even before the fall of the provisional government, Russian counterintelligence, the only one of the power structures that Kerensky did not destroy and liquidate, had dug up new material on Grushevsky. According to some sources, he was going to be arrested again and face quite serious charges. And about the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, and about the Sich Sagittarians. But October broke out, and a little later, the situation changed quite dramatically. Subsequent events in Ukraine led to a long and abundant bloodshed. And yet, sometimes, no matter how amazing it may seem, they also have a frankly comic connotation. However, this does not happen so rarely in a war, and not necessarily in a civil one. In Ukraine, it began exactly what best meets the songs from the famous adventure film. The civil war is raging from dark to dark. It was as if an evil genie, or even more than one, had been released from the bottle. Sensing the weakness of the provisional government, the outskirts of Russia amicably gathered for an autonomous voyage. And not only the Baltic states, Finland and the Caucasus, having seriously prepared white-green flags, they started talking about broad autonomy in Siberia. The Don, Cuban and Orenburg Cossack troops were seriously going to become independent powers. Could Ukrainian independent artists sit still in such conditions? No way. So far, they have cautiously started talking about autonomy, and organized the Central Rada, whose chairman was Grushevsky, who rushed urgently from the depths of the Moscow ores. Little by little, Ukrainization began in the Russian army. In Ukrainian, those regiments were rewritten, where the majority were Little Russians. By the way, the order on the Ukrainization of one of the corps was signed by none other than General Kornilev, well, a very big patriot of Russia. The appetites of the self-employed were still very moderate. At first, only the Kiev, Podolsk, Poltava, Volyn and Chernihiv provinces became part of the autonomy. Appetite, as you know, comes with eating. When Kerensky's darling recognized the right of the Rada to govern these provinces, the Rada, emboldened after his fall, on November 20th, according to the new style of 1917, announced the creation of a completely sovereign Ukrainian People's Republic. Grushevsky became the president of COI again. Novorossiya was also included in the composition of the newborn state. Interestingly, they did not claim Crimea. Grushevsky, despite all his cockroaches in his head, never considered Crimea to be Ukrainian land, and did not compose any fantasies about it. What was, was. But the professor quickly rolled out a brochure entitled "Who are Ukrainians, and what do they want?" where he wrote the former, "We, the Ukrainian people, are a special people, with our own special language, history, writing, and culture. The Ukrainian specialness has flourished." However, as evidenced not by some spiteful person, but by Grushevsky's deputy Vinichenko, it was those who could not even speak Ukrainian properly, who were the most extreme, irreconcilable nationalists. The Rada, taking advantage of the general chaos, occupied Novorossiya, Kharkiv region, Yekaterinoslav region, Kulm region, which the Poles considered their native land, Donbass and Krivory. The Reds, who did not like the Rada very much, raised a rebellion in Kiev, where the workers of the arsenal plant became the main striking force, but it was brutally suppressed. Then, the Red Army units moved to Kiev, under the command of Muravyev, actually a left sister, who later rebelled against the Soviet government, but quickly took a bullet. They quickly found themselves under the capital of the Upper, which they had every chance to occupy, due to the weakness of the Rada army. But then external forces intervened. The Central Rada concluded its separate Brest peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary a month before the Bolsheviks, and the troops of the two powers entered Ukraine. In the future, I will call them Germans and Austrians only when it comes to some independent actions of both, and in other cases, for the sake of saving time, I will simply call them occupiers. The Reds could not compete with this well-organized and well-armed force so far, and retreated. However, if we continue about the Central Rada, the song inevitably comes to mind. For a short time the music played. The Frere danced for a short time. The Rada has cut to the root, first of all, the land issue. As in Russia, the majority of the population of Ukraine were peasants. A few years later, Stalin would say something like this in one of his speeches: "The peasantry, regardless of which country the case is in, considers any new government primarily from a practical point of view." And how is she going to decide about the land? With the agrarian reform, the Rada turned out badly. The landlords' lands began to be socialized, that is, they were subscribed to the state, but the mechanisms for transferring it to the peasants were not worked out. Moreover, they began to socialize not the landlords, but the well-to-do peasants, which nevertheless added complacency. On the contrary, the poorer peasants had long behaved like their class brothers in Russia. They kicked the landlords out of their estates, divided the land and property, somehow not bothering with socialization. In addition, under the terms of the peace treaty, Ukraine pledged to provide the two victorious powers with 60 million pounds of bread, 3 million pounds of live cattle, 400 million eggs, and hundreds of thousands of pounds of other products, lard, butter, sugar. It was for food that the invaders came in the first place. In their countries trapped in the blockade, it was moving towards the most severe famine. Ukraine pledged to supply all food and all livestock absolutely free of charge, for which it was necessary to take it from the peasants just as free of charge. And where else? Three things have always infuriated the peasantry of any country: mobilization of recruits, tax increases, requisition of products. Files started working everywhere in the villages. Many, leaving the collapsed front, took rifles with them, rightly believing that in conditions of complete chaos and uncertainty in the economy, a winter would be very necessary. And now, they were turning rifles into sawn-off shotguns. It's a simple matter. The barrel is shortened with a file, the butt is instantly sawn off with a conventional saw. The wooden bed is shortened with a saw and a knife. With skillful hands and a good tool, the work will not take even an hour. There will be no longer the same range, but at close range, the kill rate remains. And it is much more convenient to hide a sawn-off shotgun under clothes than openly carrying a long rifle. There was a rumor that a serious Batko and defender Nestor Ivanovich Makhno appeared, who certainly would not let the grain grower offend either the city talkers or the devil. German. The father definitely showed up, and the people rushed to him. Little by little, a real guerrilla war unfolded. And in addition, some villages, having fenced themselves with trenches, fought with their neighbors, then with any newcomers from outside. In Soviet times, the film Duma about a British woman was banned from showing, although advertising posters with Nikolai Malyalin were already hanging everywhere, and an article about him with footage from the film appeared in the Soviet Screen magazine. The film just tells about one such village, the British, where the inhabitants proclaimed the British Republic of Soviets. Alas, I still haven't been able to watch it. Grushevsky and his government were simply unable to do anything serious against the peasant rebels. Although other late sources claim that Grushevsky had 50,000 bayonets under his command. According to the exact data of the headquarters of the German troops in Ukraine, the Rada's army consisted of 2,000 former soldiers and officers, unemployed and adventurers. So order was maintained only where the occupiers' units were located, and Makhno, in fact, owned the rest of the territory. Besides, like a bolt from the blue, a serious scandal broke out at a government meeting where something epoch-making was probably being discussed that had nothing to do with the rough prose of life. A German military team unceremoniously broke in, and its commander announced that he had come to arrest the Interior Minister, the Director of the Interior Ministry Department, the Foreign Minister, and the Minister of War. Only the first two were available, and the Germans immediately grabbed them. It turned out that on the orders of this very warm company, determined armed lads seized a wealthy Kiev banker Abram the Good in his own house and took him to Kharkiv. In fact, he was a political opponent of the Rada and its policies, criticizing both out loud. However, it was not at all that Dobry was allegedly plotting against the Rada, but in the most vulgar racket. 100,000 rubles were extorted from the banker, for which amount he signed the check, after soft persuasion, such as a revolver muzzle under his nose. And since Dobry played almost a key role in the Rada Commission conducting economic negotiations with the occupiers, the Germans very quickly began to look for him. By that time, it turned out that the Prime Minister and several other officials from law enforcement agencies were involved in the abduction. They were swept away too, and the entire racketeering company was given over to the German military court. Although it was not particularly violent, the Prime Minister and the Minister of War received 2 years, the rest and the weather at all. Even without this scandal, it was already clear to the occupiers that you can't cook porridge with the Central Rada, since it does not control the situation at all. Austrian agents reported to Vienna that there was no Ukrainian Republic in reality, that this was just a phantom, that there were a bunch of young politicians of a very radical direction, who somehow managed to find themselves in the role of the government. The Austrian Count Fergatch expressed himself even more emphatically. They are all intoxicated with their socialist fantasies, and therefore it is not necessary to consider them people of sound mind and sober memory, with whom it would be possible to talk about serious matters. The population does not even treat them with hostility, but with ironic contempt. Similar reports were sent to Berlin. Socialism was not mentioned for the sake of a red word. There were no Bolsheviks in the Central Rada, but there were a lot of socialists and Marxists of other directions crammed there. Mensheviks, social revolutionaries and other varieties. Many somehow forget that there were many left-wing socialist, Marxist parties, and their differences with the Bolsheviks relate primarily to various interpretations of the works of the bearded prophet. As the old vulgar anecdote says, if things go badly in a brothel, it's not the beds that are changed, but the girls. This is about what the Germans took seriously, even before the scandal with Dobry. There were enough experts of Ukrainian history in the headquarters and special services of the occupiers. It was decided to revive the Hetmanate, in the hope that the people would like it and calm the passions. The candidate was found quickly. Pavel Petrovich Skoropatsky, a direct descendant of the ancient Hetman, a former lieutenant general of the Russian Imperial Army, the largest Ukrainian landowner, a connoisseur of 6 languages, whose estate Trostanets by that time the peasants burned to the ground. A man, it must be admitted, interesting, and in some ways extraordinary. Being a brilliant cavalry guard, he voluntarily went to the Russian-Japanese War in the Cossack unit, where he received a gold weapon and colonel's shoulder straps for bravery over his St. Petersburg mansion, even before he left for the war, and until the revolution itself. The yellow-blue Ukrainian flag was flying, which the authorities looked at with sad philosophy, and did not take any measures. Skoropadsky was also a member of the Tsar. This mansion has become a kind of club of little Russians. There was no talk of any violent actions in favor of independence, but the Tsar's aide-de-camp eventually received this title as well. He regularly arranged Ukrainian evenings with Little Russian cuisine, and long conversations for the old days. Well, the fact that Skoropadsky, who became a general, fought a lot against the Germans, did not bother the latter at all. Big politics does not indulge in emotions. The main thing, a solid and decent man. Even before the German choice fell on him, Skoropadsky very vigorously tried to engage in politics on his own. He established the so-called Cossack Rada, which, according to his plans, was to replace the Central Rada. However, he had very meager forces, even against the background of Grushevsky's small army, and Kiev quickly annulled the Cossack Rada. Now Skoropadsky's spirits rose. It all started with a circus. A hardened circus entrepreneur participating in the enterprise, he would certainly have posted posters. The only time in the arena was Hetman Skoropatsky. Hurry up to see. There is no special irony here. It was in the circus building on Mykolaiv Street that the chosen All-Ukrainian Congress of Grain Growers gathered by unknown people. Other admirers of Skoropadsky call its participants only strong owners, farmers, but they were the largest landowners in Ukraine who had already suffered from socialization. Skoropadsky, picturesquely dressed up as an old Cossack, appeared in the arena and made a speech about the primordial liberties and brilliant prospects. By an overwhelming majority of votes, he was immediately elected hetman of the newly established Ukrainian state. The circus continued for some time. It turned out that neither the occupiers, who were formally neutral, nor the hetman had any precise plans of action drawn up in advance. Which objects to occupy in the first place, which in the second. This blunder cannot be attributed to the fact that neither the Germans nor the hetman had any experience of coup d'etat. The Bolsheviks didn't have it either. However, they just made a clear plan. First, seize the post office, telegraph, telephone exchange, do not let the currency build bridges, and then follow the list. And everything went quickly and efficiently. Skoropadsky himself artlessly narrates about the situation in his memoirs. Night came. There has not been a single institution of significant importance behind me yet. Meanwhile, the Germans, as Alvin Slabin told me, began to look at the matter somewhat gloomily. They believed that if I was not able to personally occupy a government building, a ministry of some kind, if the state bank was not taken by my supporters, my case would be lost. I ordered to collect everything that was left with me, and seize at all costs the site on Lipki, where the War Ministry, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the State Bank were located. About 2 o'clock in the morning, it was done. The task of the newly made hetman was facilitated by the fact that he did not meet anything like serious resistance. There were few fools to die for the Central Rada. Her Sich Sagittarians partly fled, seeing such innovations, partly sat down in the barracks, and sat quietly, like a mouse under a broom. General Grekov, the Deputy Minister of War, disappeared somewhere, as if nothing had happened. The Chief of the General Staff, Colonel Slavinsky, went over to the hetman, as did the division guarding the Rada, headed by its commander. After that, she quickly ran away, and was glad herself. Only 3 hetman officers were killed in sluggish skirmishes, and the deposed suffered no losses at all. The hetman Sikovix broke into the residence of President Grushevsky at ease, and announced in simple soldiers' words that he was no longer the president, but it was so unclear who. And sent, as they say, on a walking erotic journey. Since the bearded troll was in no hurry to follow the indicated direction, he was dragged out by the collar into the street, and again offered the same journey. Grushevsky was so enraged by such sudden political innovations that he loudly called the soldiers Muscovites, although there were only Galicians there. On April 29, 1918, the short and in general inglorious reign of the last Ukrainian hetman, who fully justified his surname, began. It was enough for 6.5 months. The hetman himself will tell you about the state of affairs best of all. Almost everything was demoralized. It took a long time to choose a person, because one turned out to be a scoundrel. The other was a person completely unsuitable for his political beliefs. The third went only for a salary, not intending to work. The Ministry of Finance was in a kind of rudimentary state. The Ministry of Agriculture, on the contrary, has many employees, but all these gentlemen were engaged exclusively in politics. In addition, there was another terrible evil: every scoundrel, draped in the toga of Ukrainians, considered himself booked. And so on and so forth. Things weren't so bad on the diplomatic front. By June, the Ukrainian state was recognized by 30 states, although not the most significant. France, England, and the United States declared recognition only in November, when the Ukrainian power had only a few days left to live. Sculpture, too, was not bad. The Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, the Academy of the General Staff, the Academy of Arts, 2 state universities, the National Archive, the National Library, the National Theater, the Museum, the Conservatory, the chapel were founded. Hetman's troops occupied 3 Belarusian counties, part of the Kursk and Voronezh provinces, where a certain number of Ukrainians lived. It was Skoropatsky who first expressed Ukraine's claims to Crimea. Ukraine cannot exist without owning Crimea. It will be a kind of torso without legs. In Crimea, the Bolsheviks actually sat, but with small forces. In the meantime, the Crimean Tatars created their own government, the Kurultai, and for old time's sake, started talking about independence under Turkish patronage. The troops of the occupiers moved to the Crimea. At first, they were accompanied by the Ukrainian brigade of General Natyev, but a week later, the Germans put pressure on the hetman and forced her to withdraw. The Germans were not going to be liberal with the Tatars. General von Sich was instructed to convey to the revived Turks, sparing their feelings as much as possible, that the creation of an independent Tatar state was out of the question. Kurultai was very offended, but they understood perfectly well that you can't really fight against the Germans and Austrians. The Germans had Napoleonic plans: move from Crimea to the Caucasus and Turkestan, and if possible, to India. The Austrians were crammed into companions in this fascinating campaign, but the Germans frowned, not wanting to share with their younger sister. Since there were 1.5 million German colonists living in the former Russian Empire, not counting Poland and the Baltic states, who were mainly engaged in agriculture, another bright idea came to some German heads: to relocate them all to the Crimea and make it a German colony. Sevastopol should be made a German Gibraltar on the Black Sea, the Crimean Tatars should be reined in, and the hetman should not be allowed to do Crimean affairs at all. The territories already seized are enough for him. Meanwhile, the hetman suffered. He never forgot that his grandmother was descended from Gabinovich in a direct line. Therefore, Skoropatsky's inserts began to seriously discuss plans for the creation of a Ukrainian kingdom, with the hetman on the throne and his eldest son Peter as the heir to the Tsarevich. It was all a circus, and the cultural and diplomatic successes of the hetman and his dreams of the throne. There was only one way to stay in power: by winning the sympathy of the peasantry. And with this, it was just the opposite, because of the very land issue. Try to guess how the largest Ukrainian landowner began to solve it. Exactly. The landlords who had fled everywhere began to settle in their former estates with the help of the bayonets of the occupiers and the hetman's imperial guards. Landowners were returned land, livestock, movable property. Peasants who tried to resist passwords were shot, hanged. As a result, Makhno's rebel army grew to enormous proportions. Makhnovist wheelbarrows, shrouded in gunpowder smoke, raced around the Shlyakhs. A real war has unfolded. According to Ukrainian sources of that time, 30,000 German and Austrian soldiers were killed in battles with the partisans, and Ukrainian losses, both among the hetmans Sich and among peasants subjected to uniform terror, are estimated at about 50,000 people.